Welcome back to another Tactical Fly Fisher video, everyone. As I've looked at all the comments and we've gotten calls and things from customers in the shop after our last few YouTube videos, one of the clear themes was that folks wanted a video about how to cast micro leaders better. So in this video, I'm going to give you some tips on how to go about doing that. Let's start by thinking about a typical fly cast with a regular fly line. When you have a fly line that has a significant amount of mass compared to a Euro nymphing leader or flies on a Euro nymphing rig, that fly line moving through the air builds up some inertia. And we've talked about inertia in some of our other videos recently, so you might have that concept fresh in your mind. But coming back to that inertia, as the fly line is moving through the air, it wants to continue moving in the direction and at the speed that it's going until opposite forces or external forces act on that. So one of those would be wind resistance, obviously. But the other is as that fly line turns over and straightens out, the tension from the rod is going to stop that line. But that force from the rod stopping the line also bends the rod and stores energy, which can be used in the opposite direction. So, as you'll see in this clip here, as I make a back cast and it turns over, the rod loads and bends, and then as I make a forward cast, I move that rod through the casting stroke and then stop the casting stroke on my forward cast, and that releases that stored energy and transmits it down the fly line. Once you've released that stored energy and you've stopped your cast, that energy travels down the fly line through that ever-changing taper, and as it gets towards that thinner head, it starts to dissipate and then continues to dissipate as it goes through your tapered leader, and then that ends up turning over your leader, hopefully in a predictable manner, to deliver it to your target. In order to get maximum efficiency and to end up being more accurate and predictable with where that fly goes, it's important to look at the arc that your rod travels through during the casting stroke. If you have a narrow casting arc, then you're able to form a casting loop, which is that shape that forms during the cast, either on the forward or the back cast. If you're able to form a narrow casting loop, most of the energy stored from your cast will be directed at your target. However, the wider your casting arc gets, the more loss you're going to have in energy around that casting arc, mainly through centripetal force and directing energy away from your target. So if you can make a compact casting stroke with a narrow arc that turns into a narrow fly casting loop, and you get smooth energy transfer that's also efficient toward your casting target. Obviously, there are a lot of differences between casting a traditional fly line and casting a micro nymphing leader, but a lot of the same principles of physics are occurring in both types of rigs when you cast them. So keep those principles that we just talked about in mind as we move on to talking about casting a micro Euro nymphing leader. The main difference we have when we're looking at a micro Euro nymphing leader is that you don't have any mass or stiffness in the leader itself that will help you transmit that stored energy from that loaded fly rod through your cast after you've stopped it. So what you're doing instead with a micro leader is you're loading the fly rod just like you would with a normal fly line. You're still bending the fly rod and storing energy, but that energy is transferred directly to your nymph that's weighted instead of through the fly line and then out through a tapered leader towards your fairly unweighted fly in a lot of cases with a traditional fly cast. More or less, the leader is kind of just along for the ride when casting a micro Euro nymphing leader. So the main difference that will help you with learning how to cast that rig better is changing your casting angle. So let's move into some tips about how to cast your micro leader better. And if you're not down to casting the full micro leader yet, these tips can still be applied to any other style or formula of Euro nymphing leader. The first tip is to use a sidearm angle with your cast. If we go back to that clip with the traditional fly line, I mainly have a fairly vertical rod angle, and I'm making that casting motion largely over my head or over my right casting shoulder. If we now switch to casting that micro leader, if you look at this clip, I'm making that back cast and my forward cast largely out to the side or kind of parallel to the water surface, or in another way of saying it, with a sidearm cast. Using that sidearm cast helps clear the fly around the rod and avoid having the fly or the flies running into your leader while you're making the cast. In addition, a lot of people suffer from tip wrap, or their leader getting wrapped around their rod tip when they're casting a micro Euro nymphing leader. If you use that sidearm cast, you'll have less occurrence of tip wrap and fewer tangles as well. My next tip will run a bit contrary to what you might have heard me say in some previous casting instruction in our modern nymphing video series, or even some other casting videos that I've done on YouTube. And that is that when you're using a micro nymphing leader, I actually like to take the oval out of the casting stroke, or at least just make the oval really narrow. So I've talked a lot about using an oval cast previously, and when you have a thicker Euro nymphing leader, that stiffness from the material helps transmit some of that energy from your cast down the leader and result in good turnover. And by using that oval, you can once again make the flies travel around the rod tip and have a little more tension actually during the casting stroke, and then that helps you be more accurate. However, with a micro Euro nymphing leader, you don't have any of that stiffness, you don't have any properties from the leader itself that help you transfer that energy. So if you make an oval cast, you actually just waste a lot of energy, once again, through centripetal force as it's going through the air. If you have a fairly heavy rig, let's say a rig where you have at least one 3.3 millimeter bead or heavier, or a couple of 2.8 millimeter beads or heavier, then you can get away with that oval casting stroke, and you have enough weight that it helps transmit that stored energy better, and the oval cast can still work. But as you get lighter and lighter, you're going to lose a lot of energy, especially due to wind resistance, if you use an oval casting stroke. So whenever I'm using a single fly rig with a 2.8 millimeter slotted tungsten bead or less, or if I have a 2-fly rig and they're both 2.3 millimeters or less, something like that, then I try to reduce the oval shape during my casting stroke as much as possible, and I mainly just make that cast more or less straight back and straight forward and as compact as possible. So if you look at the rod tip during my cast, it is moving really quickly. I generate a lot of line speed that goes through the leader, or leader speed in this case, but my hand is not moving very far during the casting stroke. So my casting stroke is short or compact, but quite energetic. And you can make that motion either at the wrist or the elbow, but that's where your main pivot during the cast needs to come from, is from either one of those two joints. In order to help with that short but energetic stroke, involve as little shoulder as possible, and you need to keep that elbow low and tight to your body during your false casts or your main casting motion. I don't raise that elbow away from my body until I make my final forward cast and I get into fishing position. And then I want to raise that elbow so that I can reach and extend my drift across the river, and then go about managing slack and following the drift. But that elbow doesn't come up and away from my body until I've made that final cast. If that elbow comes out and away from your body, it tends to make it so the casting stroke actually comes mainly from your shoulder. If you make that casting motion from your shoulder, it tends to slow your casting motion down. You build up less leader or line speed, your rod tip travels slower, and your casting stroke ends up being longer but less energetic. In addition, it moves through a wider arc, and the same principle ends up applying as it did with regular fly casting, where if you move that rod through a wider arc, you lose energy through centripetal force as your rod tip is traveling around that arc. In addition to pivoting at the shoulder, resulting in that longer but slower casting stroke, a lot of anglers end up pivoting at their hips as well. So they involve their torso in the cast. And this is a really common issue I see, not just with Euro nymphing casts, but with traditional fly casts as well. If you end up pivoting both at your shoulder and at your hips, and you rotate or bend in your torso, then once again, your rod travels through a wider arc, and you just end up wasting casting energy that's not going directly toward your target. And you lose energy and accuracy if you start twisting or bending at the waist. So if you watch me cast in this clip, My torso is very still. My shoulders hardly move at all. All of the casting motion comes just through my wrist or my elbow. My elbow is down tight, and that casting motion, once again, is really short and compact, but energetic. If you can really dial in having that short and compact stroke, an energetic stroke, you'll get your energy focused directly at your target or on opposite of your target during your back cast, and you'll get better delivery of that cast. As a concrete example, for this clip right here, I've only got a single 2mm tungsten bead on this fly. And if you'll look at the stroke that's focused mainly on my wrist, you'll see I still generate a lot of line speed, and the leader turns over really straight and predictably if you watch it as it goes beyond my rod tip during the forward casting stroke. Now, if you watch where I open up that casting stroke, I make it longer, I pivot at my shoulder and at my waist, the casting stroke gets a lot longer, it moves through a little more of an oval, it's less energetic and slower, and the leader does not turn over very well on that forward cast. There's just not enough weight to continue the momentum of that cast down through the leader and to the weight of that nymph toward my intended target. So especially as you get to fishing lighter and lighter rigs, which I've talked about in a lot of our videos recently, really dialing in that short and energetic stroke is going to help you propel that cast exactly where you want toward the target, and that becomes even more critical if you start dealing with some wind. Tied into that stroke and the pivoting at your torso, the next tip is to put your dominant foot forward. So if you're a right-handed caster, put your right foot forward. If you're a left-handed caster, put your left foot forward. What this stance does for you is it makes it so that it's actually harder to twist your torso and your shoulders. If you are sitting at home wondering about this, try standing up, put your right foot forward in that stance, and then twist your body. See what happens. You'll see that as you rotate to the side where you might go if you made a back cast, so if you rotate right, if you're a right-handed caster, you'll feel your obliques start to stretch, especially on your left side, and your lower back on the right side start to clench, and then your spine gets twisted and a little bit uncomfortable. You actually feel that twisting or that rotation motion in your body if your right foot is forward. If you put that left foot forward, then you can make that rotation motion over your right shoulder really easy, at least in comparison, and you don't feel that tightening of your muscles as much. So it's easier to make that rotation without really knowing that you're doing it. And if you'll put that dominant foot forward, it actually becomes uncomfortable to make that rotational twist in your torso. In addition, by having that dominant foot forward, you can reach out across the river a lot easier, and it'll give you an extra 6 inches to a foot of reach just by being able to put that right foot forward and reach that butt of the rod across the river. So if I start with my right foot forward, but then I go to put my right foot back, you'll see that my hand gets a lot further away from the camera. That's exactly what happens when you're out there fishing. If you put your right foot forward, you can reach across the river more. Simple as that. So you can fish further away and hopefully spook less fish. So this is not only a benefit for the casting, but also for your presentation and your drift. The next tip is to make sure that you have the same quick, energetic stroke on the forward and the back cast. A lot of the people that I've watched cast, they have sort of unequal application of energy on their back cast compared to their forward cast. So most of the time I would say they have a weaker back cast, and then they compensate by trying to drive that forward cast because they don't feel it load on the back cast. So make sure that your back cast is just as energetic as your forward cast. Really get that rod moving quickly, but still in that short, compact stroke. And then wait all the way until you feel what I call the doink on your back cast. So this is true whether you're making a traditional fly cast, like you'll see in this clip. I've just made the back cast, I'm waiting, and then in my left hand, that fly line is going to tighten and vibrate as that cast turns over. Same thing happens on a Euro nymphing cast. You make that back cast, and you're gonna have largely just some slack in your Euro nymphing line, or if you're using a really long leader, you'll just feel it in the leader where there's just slack, there's nothing going on. But eventually, if you wait long enough and you've made an energetic enough back cast, then that Euro nymph line is going to vibrate in your hand once again, and that is your signal to make your forward cast. It happens on both sides of the cast as well. If you look right here on the forward cast, I'm waiting until that line vibrates in my hand once again. I also would say that if you've felt that, it's better to wait a little too long than not long enough when you're making Euro nymph casts. You can always let that fly turn over and then drop behind you and then make your forward cast, and then you'll still be accurate. But if you don't wait long enough, that fly is going to be traveling rearward, still going back as you're coming forward, and then you get basically a shock in the leader, which makes it so that you lose all that accuracy on the forward cast. So wait until you feel that doink, that tightening or vibration, just like a guitar string in the Euro nymph line, before you make that forward cast. The best way to figure this out is to go out and practice in your yard and just make repeated forward and back casts. Just false cast, false cast, false cast, but make sure that you start with at least a 2.8 or a 3.3 millimeter bead on your rig. Just kind of go out with a single fly. You can even break the hook off if you want so you don't snag anything, and repeatedly practice making that cast and get used to feeling that vibration in your Euro nymphing line as you are waiting for that cast to turn over. Then, once you're out on the river, if you need to fish lighter flies than that, you'll have that mental clock that's in your head that tells you, oh, well, I make a cast that's about this long, I need to wait at least that long for the flies to turn over. Because the thing to remember is that as you get down to a single 2.3 millimeter bead or even a 2 millimeter bead, as I had in that previous clip, you're not going to get nearly as much mass that's pulling on the rig and then causing that vibration as you stop that cast. So you're not going to have that same sensation, at least it won't be as obvious in your line hand to make you start and stop that cast. So build up that mental clock by practicing casting with the heavier fly, and it'll be pretty close to the same once you get down to those lighter flies that don't transmit energy through that line as well. The last tip I have for you today is to use the 180 degree principle when you're making your cast. This is another one that applies to either traditional fly casting or casting Euro nymphs on a microleader. And this casting principle states that you should make your back cast directly opposite of where you want your forward cast to land, so 180 degrees away. If you're watching this clip here on the drone, I stop the cast. The rod keeps traveling for a second, but when you see it recover and bounce back, where I stop that rod tip is pretty darn close to 180 degrees from where I end up stopping and the rod recovers back to during the forward cast. And if you'll use that 180 degree principle, then you're going to have a lot more accurate cast. When you combine those last two tips, my parting message to you is that if you're dealing with accuracy issues, if your fly is landing to the side one way or the other of where you want it to go on your forward cast, then you haven't used one of the last two tips I provided. So make that back cast energetic. Wait till you feel that doink or that vibration in the back cast that's told you that your fly has turned over and is tightening your leader. And make sure that you stop that back cast exactly opposite of where you want it to go on your forward cast. And if you line those things up together, you will get a cast that is delivered accurately and to your target. And hopefully you'll get used to making nice predictable casts with your micro Euro nymphing leader, and you'll get your nymph where you want it to go and end up catching more fish. And also, you'll be willing to put it into some tight places along banks where you might not have fished before. So I hope this casting video helped you out and provided some tips and things to think about and evaluate in your own cast to help you out when you're out there fishing on the water. If you continue to struggle with your cast, one of the best things you can do is to go out and have somebody film you. So we've all got loved ones who are around us, hopefully, and if you ask one of them to take your phone, put it into slow motion mode, especially, have them film you from different angles, watch your body, evaluate it for all of the different tips I went through in this video. Are your shoulders rotating? Are you bending forward and back at the hips? Is your elbow extended during the cast? Are you making that cast at your shoulder? Or have you made made it a much more short, compact, energetic stroke that's mainly pivoting at the wrist or the elbow, and your shoulders are stationary and not moving during the stroke, and your dominant foot is forward. Combine those all together, watch it on film, and hopefully that'll help you evaluate exactly what your body is doing when you make your stroke, and you can make some adjustments that will help you cast better. If you liked the video, please click that like button, give us a thumbs up, and drop us a comment to let us know what you thought. And then come on over to tacticalflyfisher.com. We really appreciate those of you who are our customers and support our store. We're happy to help you out with your gear needs, whether it's on the water or at the fly tying vise. Thanks again for watching. Have a great one.